You may be seated.
Thank you, worship band, and thank you all of you for braving the weather and the craziness and being here in person. Those of you who are joining us online, we're always thankful for you. I'm thankful we have power. We lost it twice getting ready this morning, and I'm glad we can still share this way as well. About early 2000s, I don't remember the exact year, but I know it was the early 2000s for several reasons. At that point here at Morrison Hill, I was one of two primary worship leaders, the children's minister and the youth minister all at once. So it was a different era. And I remember one of the girls from junior church came up to me, and she said, I just want you to know I'm not going to be at junior church next week. And I said, oh, you're going on a trip? She goes, no, I'm just not going to come anymore. I know all the Bible stories. And I was like, really? You know them all? And then I stood there flabbergasted because she was pretty small and she rattled them off. She goes, every year we talk about creation and the flood and the Tower of Babel and Daniel in the lion's den. And she listed a lot of really commonly known Bible stories. And I was like, you know what? We do tell those ones a lot. There's other stories out there. She goes, well, you never tell them. And I said, well, I'll tell you what. Brocky, so some of you know who she is. Next week, we're starting a brand new series called The Other Bible Stories. I made that up just on the spot. I didn't know, but I was like, you know what? Here's what we're going to do. Looking back, I actually shared that story not too long ago at a leadership deep dive because that's a really dumb way to lead people. Is just whatever anybody complains, you just kind of make something up new on the spot. That's not a good idea. I've repented of that way of leading since then. But I'm really glad I kept that promise to her because that actually not only brought her back in, it invigorated a lot of the other kids. A lot of the other kids really liked those stories, and it started me on a path of actually enjoying creating my own curriculum, and that led to a bunch of other things as well. Sometimes even our dumb promises, when we keep them, can pay off. Sometimes keeping a dumb promise is the worst thing you can do. Today we're going to look at some stories, especially one story where somebody made a really dumb promise. And I hope that as we do this, that God speaks to each one of us in different ways. Let's start here together, if you would. I'd love for you to say this out loud with me. This should be the foundational truth. This should be the go-to. As Christians, this should be the go-to bottom line. Okay? This is where we should start the conversation. Let's say it together. We keep all our promises. That should be the expectation. And here's why. Because God is a promise keeper. God keeps his promises, and he expects us to keep ours. He wants us to keep the vows that we make to him and to other people. What we do, whether it's good or bad, reflects back on God because we belong to him. Our ability to keep our word reflects back on his word. Our ability to be trustworthy reflects back on his trustworthiness or not. So that should be where we start this conversation. And there are some great examples in the Bible of people who made promises and kept them well. One of my favorites is Ruth. You can find her in the book of Ruth. And if you haven't read that recently, I encourage you to read the whole thing. It's got 4 chapters. It's a great story. You could read it in one sitting, and it's great. But in case you've never heard it, I don't know if there's anybody who's never heard it. Here's the bare bones bottom line. It happens in the exact same era as the Judges, where several of these stories have been happening. That's the opening line. In the days when the Judges ruled. It's somewhere in the middle of that whole endless loop that we've been looking at. And there was a famine in Bethlehem, and so a family went to Moab, which was a nearby country. She was from Moab. And as that family, they grew up, the boys married local Moabite women. She was one of them. And then the father and both sons died. The mother, whose name was Naomi, decides to go home. And the 2 girls that they had married, one of whom was Ruth, decided to go with her. About halfway home, she says, hey, listen, you don't need to do this. In fact, you probably shouldn't. I got nothing to offer you. I have nothing. I'm going home. I'm hoping for the best, but you should just go home. And one of the girls did. But Ruth, let's see what she said. Ruth replied, Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. That's a pretty harsh promise. May God curse me. May God punish me if I don't keep this promise. That's rough. But the cool thing is, if you know that story, she does keep it. And because this foreign woman comes to Bethlehem keeping a promise that she didn't have to keep, she ends up becoming not only having a pretty good life the rest of her life, but she's part of the lineage of Jesus Christ himself. Sometimes keeping a good promise can be the best thing, sometimes even a dumb one, but not always. Here's what happens every single time that we make a promise, or we ask somebody to trust us, or that we choose to trust somebody. There's always two simultaneous things happening at the same time. Imagine a trust fall. There's somebody falling, there's somebody catching them, right? Two things happening at the same time. One is you're acting as if that other person is trustworthy. You're not sure if they are, but you're acting as if they are, okay? You're the person falling, you're trusting them. At the same time, they've got a choice. They could catch you. They could also go, ha, 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 let's see what happens. You don't know. Two things are happening at the same time. And so for us that's why trust is so hard. It's hard for us to do the trust side of it, and it's even harder to be trustworthy. Sometimes, let's be completely frank here this morning, sometimes it's even hard to trust God or to be trustworthy to God. But in a passage we've looked at several times over the last several weeks, what God tells us is to trust in him with all your heart, to not lean on your own understanding. In all of your ways to acknowledge him, and then he will direct our paths. We have to do the trust action. We have to treat God as if he is trustworthy before we really find out for sure if he is or not. Otherwise, we're just hoping and believing. In the Psalms, it tells us Psalm 15 especially, David is actually telling us about the kind of people that God considers righteous. And in the middle of that, he says this: it's somebody who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind. Jesus Christ himself talked a lot about being trustworthy and rewarding trustworthiness and punishing people who are not trustworthy. A lot of his parables had a similar theme. And even the things that Jesus offered that are just love, it doesn't sound like a job, it just sounds like a love. Think about it, John 3:16, whoever believes in him will not perish. We have to put our trust in him. And they will know that we are his followers if we have love for one another. If we love one another like Jesus loved us. How many would how many would recognize these brands you're going to see up here? Just raise your hand if you recognize any of those brands. Yeah, we know most of those. I'm not endorsing them. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just putting them up there. You recognize them. You've seen these before, right? And most of us have some sort of an emotional reaction to those. Depending on who it is in the room and which brand you're looking at the time, it could be really positive or it could be really negative. I'm going to pick on Starbucks because that's one I frequent. I see Starbucks and I primarily think, hey, coffee. I like coffee. It's primarily good. But you might look at it and you go, ooh, don't like their politics. Or you might look at them and go, ooh, I don't like their coffee. You might go, why? Who in their right mind would pay more than $3 for a cup of coffee? It's just coffee, okay? You might go, hey, so worth it. Don't know how I'd get through life. But you have an emotional reaction to these things. And all they really are is just a logo on paper. It's really nothing at all. The reason we care about those things, the reason we get angry or excited when we see a logo is because of what it represents. And what I'd like for us to remember this morning is that's the function that we have in the world. Whether we get it right or not, when people see us, that tells them something about God. It might tell them something true. It might tell them something that's wrong about God. But it tells them something. And when they see us, they have an emotional reaction. They go, oh, Christians. Or they go, Christians. And they do the same thing about Jesus. Jesus. Or they go, oh, Jesus. It's just something to keep in mind. Our church has a logo. We worked really hard on this. It has a lot of symbols in it. And some other time when I have a little bit more time, I'll unpack it for the umpteenth time. But we worked hard on that. It really has a lot of meaning and it represents a lot of things and what we are trying to do. But let me say, our real logo is not the little black bird thing. It's us. What people really know about Morrison Hill, what Morrison Hill really is not anything about our branding. It's how we live in the world. It's how we live outside of these walls. It's how we treat each other inside these walls. It's how we welcome people who dare enough and have the courage to even try church in these crazy days. And they show up, how we treat them. That's our real brand. So, bottom line, we're going to go on with this story. It's mostly going to be a story, as usual, in this series. But I just want to say it one more time. The bottom line assumption should be, for all these reasons, that we as Christians do keep our promises. Can we agree on that? That should be the assumption. That's the go-to. That's the first. Well, of course. But let's keep going. Jesus also said, don't make many promises. We don't make many promises. Would you say that with me as well? We don't make many promises. And in fact, this is probably one of the best ways to help you keep the promises you do make, is simply don't make many. Jesus himself said this, again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. And then he lists several, in this passage, he lists several that were popular. Don't swear by your head, don't swear by Jerusalem. He goes through this whole list, and then he says, all you need to say is simply yes or no. Some translations say, let your yes be yes, your no be no. It means the same thing. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. In other words, if we live our lives in some way so that we say, hey, yeah, I'll do that, and people go, really? Well, no, I swear to God I'll do it this time. Something's wrong. Are you going to do that? No, I'm not going to. Are you sure you're not going to do that? I swear, I promise. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I do it this time. Okay? So something's wrong. Jesus said we should just represent him, period. We shouldn't have to do that. I hope that makes sense. Another big deep idea, again, we're about to go to a story, but we got to lay a foundation. This stuff is deep. And when you look in some of these obscure Bible stories, I think sometimes it's even more important that we remember some basic truths about how to understand what we see in the Bible. For example, we should never take one obscure story, 2 or 3 verses, and make an entire theology out of that. It should always be the opposite. If you find something kind of confusing or weird in the Bible, a story, a verse, a promise, a prayer, something, the whole rest of the thing should be, that's where we start. How does that fit in the context of the entire thing? And then we see how that fits in, not the opposite. The reason that I know the story I told you earlier about Brocky was early 2000s is because at that point in time, there was a little book about this big called the Prayer of Jabez. Does anybody remember that? And everywhere you looked was the Prayer of Jabez. There were T-shirts, there were CD projects, there were posters and mugs, and people were making a lot of money, okay? And if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. He expanded his territory very well. 4 people read the book. Let's go. The sad thing, the dangerous thing, and I'm not here, I never want to waste my time trying to criticize, but the sad thing is that book, it did exactly what we should not do. It took literally 2 verses out of the Bible, one obscure story about a guy who's only mentioned in 4 verses out of the Bible completely, And it changed what he did and reimagined what he did and said, this is how you be a good Christian. And the whole Christian world goes, do you see what God's doing? Have you not read the prayer of Jabez? You must not love Jesus. It should always be the other way around. So I know that it was that era because as I'm writing that, and I have my dark sense of humor, I'm writing children's curriculum, okay? But I got to this story and I titled it, The Prayer of Jephthah. That's the story we're going to do. I thought, what would happen if I wrote a little book about that prayer? You'll see why that would be so bad in a second. One more from Proverbs and then we'll start the story. In Proverbs it says this, it is a trap to dedicate something rashly and only later to consider one's vows. Would you read that out loud with me? That's kind of the thesis of this whole thing together. Let's read that straight out of the scripture together. It is a trap to dedicate something rashly and only later to consider one's vows. Let's just read this straight out of Judges chapter 11. Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. That's a good start. He lives in Gilead. He's a Gileadite, and his dad is the guy that runs the place. But we keep going. His mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. You're not going to get any inheritance in our family, they said, because you are the son of another woman. So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. All right, so far, does this sound like somebody that we need to copy? This is setting forth as a good example. Whatever he says, the way he prays, the way he handles himself in life, we should copy this guy, right? No, at best, he's kind of a Robin Hood character, living out in the woods, got some people around him. They're kind of outlaws. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not all bad. At best, that's what he is. He's not set it up in any way as a prophet or anybody who represents God. We keep going. Sometime later, when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. Come, they said, be our commander so that we can fight the Ammonites. Well, they have this little negotiation there, and basically they accept his offer and he accepts theirs, and he ends up going back, and here was the deal. I'll help you fight the Ammonites. I'll lead my band of merry men to help you fight the Ammonites if, on the other side of all this, when we win, I get to be your ruler. I don't just get to come home, I get to be the boss. And they say, okay. So, verse 11, so Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Well, this is a good sign. He not only says, hey, I'll do this, he somehow prays a prayer about it. He says, God, I promise, I vow that I will take these people into battle, and then I will lead them. So far, so good, basically. Are we good? Okay. Keep going. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. Now just remember, this is the era of the judges. We've looked at several stories here. We started with the era of Abraham and Isaac, and we moved forward. We spent quite a bit of time in that little cycle in Judges where the people reject God, they follow idols. God says, fine, do it your way, see how that works out. After a long time, usually a couple of decades, they come back around, they say, oh, wait, maybe we should ask God for help. And he goes, okay. And he sends them somebody to help them that they call a judge, which really means somebody who's just putting things right again in this context. And God sends them somebody, and they get rescued from their enemies. We're seeing this happen over and over again. Another way to see the entire book, and it makes the only way that any of these stories, I wouldn't say make sense, but the only way you can even grasp some of the crazy, ridiculous stuff that happens in the book of Judges is verse 6 in chapter 17. It says, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. That's what was going on. It wasn't just that they had no king. That means they had no leader. They had nobody that they answered to. Nobody was in charge, not even God. There's nobody that says, hey, this is what's going to happen. There's no law. So everybody did as they saw fit. And what happens in that context? Absolute chaos. Absolute garbage happens is what happens. Let's keep going. Verse 30. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. That sounds kind of sketchy to anybody? It sounds a little sketchy to me. Now, back then, to be fair, one thing we probably should at least consider is they often actually kept animals, especially their best animals, their sacrificial animals, actually in their house. They treated them as pets. The sacrificial lambs they were kind of like a dog, which I'm sure made it even harder to sacrifice them later. It was rough. But he didn't say that. He didn't say the animal. He said whatever. There's a good chance that he actually knew what was going to happen next. That's part of what's so dark and terrible about this story. Then Jephthah went to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. Again, this is God doing what God wants to do, not because of the vow that he made, not because of what Jephthah prayed. God's like, fine, if you really care about it that much, I guess. He'd already decided. The people cried out. It's in the middle of the cycle. God's already going to do what he's saying. But Jephthah makes this vow all on his own. Are we still tracking? This is a hard story, but it's so important that we understand how this works. See, Jephthah actually ends up later on, a couple times in the Bible, being listed in lists of heroes. But only in the sense of being a military hero. Only in the sense of he delivered Israel. So did Samson. Was Samson a moral paragon? Nope. Neither was a bunch of other people on that list. You see him later, he's somebody that God used to get some stuff done, but he was not a good dude. And we should never say, well, he did it, I guess that's a good idea. That's really backwards thinking. Here's the thing we can remember about God, y'all. He forgives sin. He doesn't endorse it. If you see something in the Bible that's clearly something wrong, we don't need to defend it. I've said several times I really like Rich Mullins, but in one of his songs he has a line, well, it's right there in the Bible, so it must not be a sin. I was like, what? Have you read that story? It was a sin. Anyway, just throwing that out. Judges 11, verse 34. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels? Now, if you don't know what a timbrel is, it's basically a tambourine. It wasn't made of plastic like this one, probably didn't have a little rubber thing. Probably had some sort of animal skin on one side, almost like a drum. It's this kind of stuff, okay? Nobody's going to miss this. There's no way to hide this. This is not a secret. His daughter coming out of the house, Dad won! There's no way to cover this up. Everybody knows what came out of his house first. She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." She brought him down? It's not her fault. "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends because I will never marry." "You may go," he said, and he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. Some translations render that closer to the original Hebrew, that something like she wept because of her virginity. But in modern English, that's really misleading. There's nothing wrong with being a virgin. It's a good thing, innately. What she's sad about is in their culture, it was super important that you keep passing on the bloodline. And there was no more chance for this. She's grieving that she's going to die a young, innocent girl. She's never going to experience life as an adult. That's why some of the translations change the wording, makes a little bit more sense in that way. After 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. And she was a virgin, and from this comes the Israelite tradition that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. Now, there's some other theories out there. I did some more research this time, trying to dig as deep as I could. And there are some people out there who believe that maybe he didn't actually kill her, because how could that be in the Bible? And I say, have you read the rest of the book of Judges? He killed her. He burned her alive. And some people say, well, why didn't God stop her? Why the way he stopped Abraham when he was about to sacrifice Isaac? Because that was a test. That was God's idea, and his whole idea was to show Abraham he wasn't like the other gods. He was trying to see how much God did not tell Jephthah to do this. This was all on him. This whole mess was because he made a dumb promise. So, one more thing to say out loud here with me, if you would, please. We don't make dumb promises. How many times have you committed to do something and then later regretted it? You don't have to tell me a number, but just think about that. I know I could list a bunch. How many times have you said, sure, I'll do that, or there's no way I'll ever do that. Watch me, I will never do that. Look back like, oh, wow, goodness, what was I thinking? Don't make dumb promises. It's not that we fault Jephthah or his daughter for keeping a vow to God. That's innately a good thing. That's why we started there. Innately, that's a good thing. But whenever you see something like this in the scriptures, brothers and sisters, you see something and it's just telling you the story, and it doesn't step in and explain it. It doesn't step in and say, and this was the right thing to do because God would always rather you keep your vow than anything. It doesn't say that. And it also doesn't say, and this was so clearly the wrong thing to do because what an idiot Jephthah must have been. It doesn't say that. It just tells us the story. And whenever you see something like that in the scriptures, what we need to do is ask a lot of questions. That's one of the times, instead of fighting over what our opinions about it, we need to ask a bunch more questions. Like, so is it better to God that we keep a vow than to do something really terrible? Or would he rather us do something really terrible and break the vow? Maybe sometimes it's good to just let that question hang. Maybe it's something to think about and pray about. Because each one of us has something that we probably wish we could take back. Would God rather you just keep on keeping on? Or would he rather you, wow, that was really dumb. I'm so sorry. I repent of that. Was this really God's will? Because he allowed it to happen? Was that okay with him? Did he somehow endorse this? Maybe sometimes we just need to let those questions percolate because they're going to inform us. In real life, we don't have a narrator telling us, and that was the right thing to do because John knew later on that day that blah, blah, blah. We don't know. I wish that Jephthah could have looked ahead in the Bible, but the rest of it hadn't been written yet, okay? He's in Judges. Somebody's still writing these stories down. The rest of it, we weren't there yet. But if he would have had a Bible, he could have looked way ahead to James chapter 3. Let's go there right now as we start to wrap this thing up this morning. James writes, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by a good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, There you find disorder and every evil practice. Does that sound anything at all like Jephthah? Bitter envy? Selfish ambition? Yeah. And there you find every evil practice. Even evil practices that most of us would never even conceive. Oh yeah, I'm going to offer my kids as a burnt offering to God. What? Nobody's going to do that. But when we get burnt up by bitter envy and selfish ambition, we'll do just about anything. James continues, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, and then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. That's when we know it's really God's will. Some people say, well, didn't the Spirit of the Lord come upon Jephthah earlier in that story? Yeah, to fight the Ammonites. Not to do with that. You see the difference? That was bitter envy. That was selfish ambition. But we look elsewhere in the Bible and it's pretty clear that the kind of stuff that God really endorses is this. So what do we do about it? What do I do about it? What do you do about it this morning? Here's 3 things. I'd love for you to, one more time, we're going to go backwards through these 3 big ideas, these statements we've made as Christians. And maybe there's somebody here today that isn't a Christian. And if that's the case, these are still good ideas, but it doesn't 100% have to apply to you because this is Christians saying this. This is us saying, if we're going to follow what the Bible clearly teaches, these are going to be true about us. If you're not a Christian, I'd like to invite you to become one today. But if you are already, this should be true. First thing, let's say it together. We don't make dumb promises. Brothers and sisters, here's the thing. God is not obligated to keep a promise to you that you made. Hear me on this. How many times have you ever said, God, if you just will make this and this happen, I'll never do such and such again? Anybody? I'm raising my hand. All right, God, if you'll just make this happen, I promise I'll do this over and over the rest of my life. Anybody? Okay? God is not obligated in any way on that. That was your idea. And maybe he'll honor it. Maybe he won't. That's up to him. He's a person. He's not a genie in a lamp. But he's not obligated to that. It's really important that we don't think he is, that we don't waste our time negotiating with God. It's really important that we don't make a bunch of dumb promises to God or to anybody else. Second thing, let's say it together. We don't make many promises. This one's just kind of common sense. But seriously, if it's so important that we as Christians, we're the brand of Jesus. We're God's representative. We display his image on earth. And keeping a promise is a big, big deal. We should be careful not to make very many of them. Be careful. Be wise. Redeem every opportunity. But in that context, and only in that context, then we come back to where we started. Let's say this together. We keep all our promises. We remember that our being faithful represents Jesus. In just a few moments, the band's going to come back. We're going to sing, and you'll have a chance to make any choice. But can I just speak from my heart to you? This isn't even really part of the sermon. It's just what God's laid on my heart about how this applies today. Here's what I know. There's going to be somebody in this room today, including me, that needs the courage to say, you know what, that thing that I don't think I can get out of, that promise I made, that sin that I keep doing, whatever it is, you feel trapped and you feel like there's no way I can get out. Guess what? Yes, you can. God can get you out of that. Jephthah could have got out of that vow. Are you hearing me on this? And you can get out of whatever you think is trapping you this morning. You can. That's part of what Jesus did, why he died, why he rose, so that he would give us the power to break free of anything, any mistake we've made, any out and out on purpose sin, any dumb mistake, anything. You can get free from that. And on the other side of that, it's really hard for us to make commitments these days. It's hard for us to trust. It's hard for us to trust each other. It's hard for us to trust ourselves. It's hard to trust God. But there's one ultimately trustworthy person. There's somebody who said he was going to die and come back in 3 days and somehow pulled that off. And he says he's going to come back someday. I think he's going to pull that one off too. You can trust him. And if you've never trusted him, this is your chance. Let's stand, let's sing together.